Good day everyone, welcome to ITS 101 Computer Programming 1. For this week, we will have another pre-recorded class in continuation to our discussion about C++ programming. After this class, there is going to be an assessment to your learning through Google Form, which the link will be given to you after this class. And of course, we'll also have an assignment, so be sure to watch, listen, and understand this class attentively. My name is Juleus Publico, your instructor, and today we are going to discuss about variables. So if you have any questions or concerns, comments, share it with the class. Comment your questions once this class is uploaded through our Facebook group or on our respective chat groups. In our previous discussions, we learned about C++ basics, particularly what is C++, C++ installation, your first C++ program, and of course we did our very first coding in C++ programming, which is about C++ output. Now if you haven't watched that class yet, you can copy the link being provided, or you can click the image once this presentation file is uploaded. So today we will discuss about variables. What is it and how do we use it in making a program? And under this lesson, we'll also be discussing the different data types, identifiers, definition, declaration, and initialization of variables. Okay. So before we start, let's have a little activity called where to put. So it's always good to practice segregating waste properly. Let us dispose of the waste below in the appropriate waste bin. So basically you have 3 waste bins here, and there are lists of waste that needed to be segregated. So what you're going to do is list down all the waste that should be appropriate with these 3 waste bins. We have biodegradable, non-biodegradable, hazardous. And then comment your answers to our Facebook group post, or you can either type your answers on the comment box, write it on a piece of paper, take a photo, then upload it on the comment box. Or you can use any word processing software like Microsoft Word, and then take a screenshot, then upload it in the comment box. The first 5 students to comment the proper waste segregation will get extra credit for their learning activity. Okay? Alright, so in our previous class, we learned about printing texts on our C++ program. Okay. However, programming is not limited only to printing simple text on the screen. In order to go a little further on and to perform useful tasks that really saves us work, we need to introduce the concept of variables. So at this point of our academic experience, we should have heard and encountered the term variable. Okay, whether in algebra, geometry, or just about any branch of mathematics. It is usually the symbol for representing an unknown value. So, one notable example is the use of variables in the Pythagorean theorem, which is a squared plus b squared is equals to c squared, where a, b, and c are the variables. Okay? In our previous class, we learned about printing on our C++ program. Again, today we're going to continue with uh, we're going to continue our C++ programming discussion with a variable. So a variable is a portion of memory that stores data values that our program can manipulate. Each variable in C++ has specific type, which the size, layout, range of values, and the set of operations that can be applied to the variable. So when do we use variables? We will use variables in our C++ programs once we are going to deal with any data that our program will use. And for that, we are going to set a variable for each and every data being dealt as much as possible. Note that in working with variables, our goal is to reserve a storage in our program where the data will be stored so it can be used in the program. Okay, so let's take a look at this example. For example, we are going to create a program that will add two numbers. We will be dealing with data here. Particularly, we'll be dealing with three different data. The first and the second number, and the sum. So, and each of these number must be set with variables. Okay, so let's say for example, the first number we will say it is 2, and then the second number is 3. Then if we're going to create a program that will add these two numbers, we can expect that 2 plus 3 is equals to 5. So all of these numbers must be set with variables. Okay, another example. We will create a program that will display the user's first and last name. Okay, so since first and last names are data, okay, we will set the variable for each. So again, our goal is to set a storage where we can save the data so that we can use it for the program. Okay, so let's take a look on how variables are used for a program. So this program will compute and display the sum of numbers of 5 and 6. So here, we initialize three variables. One for the first number, which is 5, and then one for the second number, which is 6, and another for the sum. So basically, it is like we just reserve a storage for all the numbers, 5, 6, and the sum, so that the program will be able to use it, in our case, by using it to compute and display the result. Okay, again, we have three variables here, which is an integer a equals to 5, and then b is equals to 6, and the result doesn't have any value yet. Okay, so that is how a variable is used. So since the the main purpose of this program is to compute the sum, so we can expect that the result is going to be 11. Again, our goal is to set the storage where we can save the data so that we can use it for the program. In this case, we are trying to compute 5 and 6. So again, we have to set a variable for the 5, we have to set a variable for the 6, and lastly, we have to set the variable for the result. In this case, it is 11. Okay, so now that we know when do we use variables, let us learn on how to write and use variables. Here are the examples of how variables are written in C++ program. So let's take a look. So we have an integer called age, which is equals to 18. Okay, a character called middle initial, which is equals to J. A string named first name, which is equals to 4, and then a result or an integer called result. So the common syntax in writing a variable is going to be data type space identifier equals value, just like this example, integer, character, and string. Or we can also write variables without having any values at all, just like this. Okay, so it is very important not to forget the semicolon, just as we discussed in our previous class. So, however, the question now would be, what are data types and identifier? Let's talk about them. Let's start with the data type. A data type is a classification that specifies which type of value a variable has. It may be number, text, paragraph, decimal points, etc. It is very important which data type to use when creating a variable. So there are many data types that we can use for C++ programming. Each data type differs to how they are used, its structure, the value size, and etc. However, in basic programming, these are the most commonly used data types, or let's say the data types that we will most likely use. Therefore, these are the ones that we are going to learn. And that will be character, integer, floating point, or double floating point, string, and boolean. So in C++, the keywords for these data types are, we have char for character, an int for integer, float for floating point, double for double floating point, string, for string, and then bool for boolean. So let's go back to our example a while ago. So here we are using integer for all the three variables. Why do we use integer? We will learn it by discussing one by one. So let's start with character. Now, if we are going to deal with any data value that includes a single character, letter, or symbol, or number, we will use char. Okay? Examples are middle initials, right? So since if we're going to create a program that will display or that will ask for our middle initial, since middle initials are just one letter, then we can use char for that. Okay? So another example is choosing multiple choices or answering a multiple choices or setting up multiple choices when we are doing examinations, right? So there are only one letter for that. So we are going to use char or character. Integer. Integer stores whole numbers without decimals. Now, if we're going to deal with numbers, we will use integer. For example, if you're going to create a program that will have mathematical operations like addition, subtraction, multiplication, and many more, this could be either negative or positive numbers. Okay? So, in programming, we no longer call numbers as numbers, but instead we call it integers. Okay? However, based on the definition of the character here, it can also store a single number too. So what would be the difference if we use integer over character when declaring a number? Simple. When we define a character for a number, that number will be treated as a compiler in the text, or that number will be treated by the compiler as a text. Again, if we're going to use character for numbers, let's say for this particular example 1, this one will no longer have numerical value to it. The compiler will read this number as a text. It cannot perform any mathematical operators. However, if we're going to set it as an integer, then we can use this number for mathematical operators. Okay? So float or floating point. Floating point or float stores fractional numbers containing one or more decimals. It is sufficient for storing 7 decimal digits. Okay, so again, while the integer deals with numbers, we will use float for decimal numbers with up to 7 decimal points. Okay, examples when to use float are, for example, we are going to compute average. Let's say sometimes average will return a decimal result. Let's say, for example, the average of 3 and 2. The average of 3 and 2 is 2.5. 3 plus 2 equals 5 divided by 2, 2.5. So we have decimal. Therefore, we will be using float. Okay, another example is if we are going to divide. Sometimes quotients are also decimals. Let's say 3 divided by 2 is 1.5. Okay, so we will use float for that. Okay, again, we will use float with decimal points up to 7. Okay, double floating point, or we'll call it double. It stores fractional numbers containing one or more decimals, sufficient for storing 15 decimal digits. So basically, it is the same with the floating point. However, the double can be used for numbers with up to 15 decimal points. So if you're doing a program that deals with numbers with few decimal points, you can either use float or double. It's totally up to you. It's going to work just the same. Okay, so the only difference is if you're going to deal with decimal points, that will, let's say if you're going to set it that the decimal point that is going to be more than 7, then instead of using float, you're going to use double. All right, next is string. It stores more than one symbol or character. This is good for words, paragraph, etc. To use strings, you must include an additional header file in their source code, the string library. Okay, so basically we will use strings for data values containing multiple characters, letters, symbols. Like for example, full words, paragraph, names, address, something like that. So however, to use it, we will include the string library. Therefore, there will be two header files now in our program when we use a string. First is we have the include. This one. We have the include IO stream. Now, if we decide to use string in our program, we'll also be including the string. Okay. And lastly, the boolean or bool. This, however, is not that commonly used. Bool will store through true and false values only. It will only display 1 for true and 0 for false. We may most likely not going to use boolean ever in our programming lesson. But since we're only talking about the boolean because it's one of the basic or primitive data type, so it's always good for you to know about it. But then again, it most likely we will never use boolean in our programmings, in our programming discussions, in our future programming discussion. And again, there are a lot more data types than just this five. To know more about them, you can either have further research on the other data types, or you will most likely learn about it on your more advanced programming class as soon as you go along with your course. Maybe it will be discussed on the programming too, or let's say the other data types will be discussed on your objective programming soon. Okay, we never know. But again, these five data types are just the most common data types that we're going to encounter, that we're going to use. Therefore, these are the data types that we're going to learn. Okay, so next is, now that we already know about data types, hopefully, let's talk about identifier. Okay, an identifier is a user-defined word to represent the variable. So programmers can either use any words or strings of alphanumeric characters as identifiers. Identifiers must always start with an alphabet or an underscore. To use an identifier, it must be written after the data type. Okay, for example, integer a, float, average, where a and average are the identifiers for the type data types int and float. Okay, to write an identifier, basically it's all up to you. Okay, since again identifiers are user defined words, you can write any word that you would like for identifier. Okay, so this could be, now for example, this could be x, y, or num1, so on and so forth. Okay, an identifier is just a word you will use to represent a single variable. It is like giving a name to one of your pets. Now, if you have lots of pets or dogs, you can address them individually by giving a name to them. So it's going to be the same idea in programming. You can define lots of variables with the same data type, but you can make those variables unique by putting an identifier on them. Okay? So let's go back to our example here. So we use three integers. We have integers a, which is equals to 5, integer b, which is equal to 6, and integer sum, which is equals to the a plus b. Okay? Although they are all of these three variables defined as integers, each one of them is unique because we give them separate identifiers. Okay? So the first integer is a, the second integer is b, and the third integer is sum. By doing so, the compiler will no longer have the problem which integer to use because we declared a specific name for it. Okay, although all of it are integer. So that is the purpose of having identifier, making all the variable as unique as possible. So whenever I will use any of this integer for the program, I will just have to tell the compiler which integer, let's say a, then the compiler will do what I programmed it to do. Okay, so here we have three, again we have three variables here. We have a, b, and c. They're both integer, but they are unique to one another because we set or we declare a specific identifier for each of them. Okay, so while you can choose any words as your identifier, there are words whose meaning is already taken or defined by C++ compilers. Thus, you cannot use it as identifiers. So these are called keywords. Okay, again, you can no longer use these words as your identifier, and that would be here. So here are the C++ keywords. You cannot use this as your identifier. You can use any identifier as you want aside from these words. Okay, take a look. Now, now that we know about data types and identifiers, let's talk about the proper way of writing a good and working variable. There are three steps: definition, declaration, and initialization. Okay? Definition. Definition is simply defining which data type to use depending on a value. Okay? For example, if the data value are numbers, then we are going to use int. Now, if the data value is going to be single letter or symbol, then we're going to use char. And then, if the number or the data that we are going to deal with are going to be numbers with decimal points, then we're going to use float or double. Again, float if it's going to be under 7 decimal points, and a double if it's going to be 7 and up decimal points. Okay? And then, if we're going to deal with words or let's say paragraphs, etc., or long words, then we're going to use string. And if we're going to excuse me, deal with options, true or false options, we are going to use bool. So that is definition, determining or defining what data type to use depending on the value. Okay, so that's the first step, definition. The next step is declaration. Declaration is writing the variable identifier. Again, identifiers must always start with with alphabetical or alphabet or an underscore. To use an identifier, it must be written after the data type. Again, it will be called declaration if you're going to set an identifier to the data type. So the syntax would be data type space identifier. Okay, just like what we discussed a while ago, you can write any word or strings of alphanumeric characters in declaring a variable. It could meaning choosing the identifier, right? Except for, of course, the C++ keywords that I've shown you previously. So in declaring a variable, first is to choose the appropriate data type, just like what we discussed in defining. Then enter the identifier. Again, it should always start with an alphabet or underscore, and not any other characters or symbol. Otherwise, it will not work. We will use variable declaration if we don't have any values to the variable yet. For example, computing a result of any mathematical operations. Let's say adding number 1 and number 2. Okay, adding two numbers. Since we don't know what is number 1, we don't know what is number 2, obviously we don't know what would be the result. So therefore, we will be using declaration, variable declaration, because we don't know what would be the result, or we don't know the actual value yet. Okay. Next, or reminder, identifiers must only include one word. Should you desire to put multiple words, you can separate them by adding an underscore, a hyphen, or just write them in a single word. For example, string, if we're going to deal with first name, you can either separate, or you can either, what would be the right term, split or merge the two words with an underscore, or you can just write the two words in one word, okay, or you can separate them with hyphen, okay. Now, next is initialization. Initialization is setting an initial value to the variable. So we will use variable initialization if we want to set an initial value to the variable. To do so, define the data type in character, string, so on and so forth, and then declare the identifier, then add the value. It is important to note that the value must agree with the defined data type. So for example, if you defined an integer, then the value must be a number. If you defined a float, then the value must be a number with a decimal, so on and so forth. We do variable initialization if we want a specific value to the variable, depending on how our program flow or the algorithm. Again, the initialized value must always agree with the data type it defines. Now, in initializing value, always remember that each data type has its way of setting values. Okay? So for characters, the value must be enclosed with a single quote. Example, car, that is the data type, and then middle initial, which is the identifier, and the value is R enclosed with a single quotation. Okay, again, for characters, the value must be enclosed with a single quotation or single quote. For strings, however, the value must be enclosed with double quotes. Okay, so for example, full name, which is string, since we are dealing with, since we declare that the full name is string, then the value should be enclosed with double quotation. Okay, however, for int, float, double, and bool, there will be no enclosure needed. So for example, for float, the average is 45.7. For integer, the result is 100. There is no need for any enclosure. Okay, so there are two formats in declaring and initializing variables. So number one, all variables must be declared and initialized separately. Okay, so for example, here we have different variables being used. We have integer, float. So basically, one of the common way of uh, writing and declaring initializing variables is to write all of those variables separately. So as you can see, we have the int a and int b is written separately from each other, as well as the float. Okay. Second way, the second format would be variables with the same data type can be declared together. However, it must be separated with a comma. Going back with example, int a and b. So when we declare the variable in this format, we know that both a and b are integers. Okay? The same with the second example, which is average and result. Okay? So if we write the variable in this format, then we know that both average and result are going to be defined or declared or defined as float. Okay, so basically similar or the same data or values with the same variables with the same data types, you can write that in a single line given that you are going to separate them with a comma. Okay, so choosing how the format of the variable will be totally up to you, but for beginners I encourage the separation of all variables to avoid getting confused. Okay, so you can just use this format since we are all beginners. We don't want any confusion. Okay, so hopefully you already understand about you already have an idea now about variables, particularly the definition, declaration, and initialization of variables. So right now, let's have a practice activities. Let's practice writing appropriate variables for the following programs or scenarios. First one, a program that displays the user's first name. Since we are dealing with the first name only, therefore there is only one variable. Okay, since we are dealing with first name only, obviously one variable. Now we all know that first names always include multiple letters or words, right? Therefore, we will use string data type. Now we will declare that the identifier of the string is first name. So since we are dealing with first name, obviously first names are multiple words or multiple. It could be either multiple words or obviously multiple letters. We will use string. And let's say our identifier is first name. Therefore, our variable should be string. Since we are using string, we defined it as string, and then the identifier first name equals to Tony. Let's say, for example, our guy's name is Tony, and the Tony must be enclosed with double quotation. Okay, our variable will be string first name equals to Tony. Don't forget the semicolon. Okay, another example: a program that displays the user's first name, last name, and age. Okay, we have three data types now, or three data now. So we have first name, last name, and age. Therefore, we will expect that we will have three variables. Since first name is, again, groups of letters or words, we will use string data type, the same with last name. However, since age is a number with no decimal or fraction, we will define it as integer. So we have data types now, string for first name and last name, int for age. Now, let's declare that our identifier for first name is this, first name, last name is this one, and then age. Then our variable is going to be string first name equals Tony. Of course, since this is string, the value should be enclosed with double quotation marks. And then last name Stark. Okay, let's say our guy's name is Tony Stark. Again, the last name must be enclosed with double quotation because we are using string. And the age is 50, given that Tony Stark age is 50, and since age is integer, there will be no need for an enclosure. All right, so that is going to be our variables for the program number 2. Last, program number 3, a program that displays the sum of two numbers. Okay, we will be dealing with first and second number, and of course the sum, because again, adding two numbers, we will have the first number, the second number, and the sum. So we will have three variables. Since we are adding numbers, it will not return a decimal result. Therefore, we will define it all as integers, diba? Since if you're going to add numbers or integers, it will always return a number as well as the result. For example, 1 plus 1, it's always 2. There will be no decimal points for that. Okay, therefore, we are going to declare, or we're going to define it all as integer. So let's say our identifier should be num1 for the first number, num2 for the second number, and sum for the third number for the sum. So our variables will be int num1, comma num2, comma sum, which is equals to a, or I'm sorry, that's wrong. Let me correct that real quick. Sum is equals to num1 plus num2. Okay, since the sum is the result of num1 plus num2. Okay, we can either write this in one single line, just like what we discussed a while ago, or you can write it separately. Int equals num1, and int num2 integer sum equals, again, num1 and num2. All right, sorry about that. Okay, that's it. So that is variables, ladies and gentlemen. If you have any question or concern, if there are any confusions, again, comment your answers down, or comment your question down to our Facebook group once I've already uploaded this one. Okay, or you can send a message through our respective chat groups. So that is all for today. That is for variables. So on our next class, we will be discussing how do we work with variable. We're going to actually apply variables in making a useful program. So right now, this is just going to be an introduction about um, variables. We will use variables. We will learn how to use variables on our next class. Okay, so I hope you learned something today. For your assessment, fill up the form for today's assessment link. Copy the link provided. The deadline would be Wednesday, since probably I'll be uploading it Wednesday. So you will be given 7 days to work with this class. The deadline would be Wednesday, November 18, 2020 at 11:59 p.m. And then assignment. Write the variables for each or for the following program. Number 1, a program that displays the quotient of two integers. Number 2, a program that displays your first name, middle initial, last name, and address. Number 3, a program that displays the average of three numbers. So you can write the identifier and value on your own. It will be totally up to you. The deadline would be Wednesday, November 18, 2020 at 11:59 p.m. through Google Classroom. Just to note, the details about this assignment will be uploaded through Google Classroom as well. Okay, so again, if you have any questions or concern, please let it be known. Thank you so much for attending this class and making this part of the video. Always keep safe and may God bless us all.